So, hello everyone. Thank you for staying with us for the last panel of this conference, especially since we're slightly moving away from political science to a related topic, sociology of education and social rights. My name is Wrase, and I'm a lawyer and sociology scholar, and I have the pleasure to chair the session in which we will deal with Ralph Dahrendorf's essay series on education as a civil right and other writings he did on education. As Timothy Garden-Esch alluded to yesterday in his keynote speech, the notion that every young citizen should be entitled to a free, quality education on the basis of equal opportunities lies at the very core of Ralph Dahrendorf's understanding of liberal rights and citizenship, since education is, quite obviously, a prerequisite for the full participation in social and political life. Dahrendorf's essays on the right to education, where he developed his thoughts on education first, was published in 1965 in the German weekly Die Zeit. That is 45 years ago. But of course, we won't just dwell on the past. The idea of this panel is that we're taking Dahrendorf's work as a starting point to discuss current trends in education policies and matters of educational equality and inequalities in Germany and in other countries like the United States. Before we start, I just want to briefly say a few words about my own relationship to Dahrendorf's work on education. When I came to the WCB just about 6 years ago, I proposed I proposed a research project which was meant to deal with the right to education as a fundamental human right. If you take a deeper look at human rights law, you will see that the right to education is a widely guaranteed civil and social right, which is enshrined in many international declarations, treaties, and conventions, like, amongst others, the International Declaration of Human Rights, the Children's Rights Convention, and the latest among those, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities from 2008, which contains the right to a non-discriminatory and inclusive education on all levels for people with disabilities. I should add that these are legally binding conventions. The idea of the project was, and that is what I've been actually working on since, to look into the legal provisions of that fundamental right to education, not only by drawing on legal arguments and literature, but also by referring to empirical findings from educational sciences. Actually, the first institution which did this was the US Supreme Court in its famous decision, Brown versus Porter Education, which you will relate to in your talk, Claudia Bookman. And we'll hear about this. This interdisciplinary approach, as you might call it, appears quite productive in order to examine, for instance, whether certain features of the education systems and their implementation, respectively, may reinforce discriminatory treatment, or whether they may, in themselves, be discriminatory against certain groups of children according to their socioeconomic background, their gender, their ethnic backgrounds, and so forth. Those of you who are familiar with the work of Dahrendorf will immediately see the connections to his approach as a sociologist. In some regards, you might say, I only had to take up the general ideas by Ralph Dahrendorf and put them in a human rights context. And his work has actually, since then, been a companion to my work on this issue. I won't say much on Dahrendorf's essay itself, since we will hear a lot about it from our panelists, who I'm now going to very briefly introduce to you. The first speaker at this panel is Claudia Bookman. She is College of Arts and Sciences Distinguished Professor of Sociology at Ohio State University. Claudia calls herself a sociologist of stratification, and her main areas of research are comparative and international sociology, education, gender, race, and ethnicity. Her research includes cross-national and comparative studies of the impact of economic policies and institutional forces on educational outcomes, as well as case studies of stratification and mobility in Africa. Her current focus lies on gender, race, and class inequalities in education in the United States and internationally, So Claudia brings a specific American perspective to Dahrendorf, and I know that she also refers to some court cases and legal findings, which I find which I'm really enthusiastic about as a lawyer, and I think it will be very fruitful for our discussion. So she'll be the first speaker, and the second speaker will be Barbara Ischinger. Barbara Ischinger had been the head of the Directorate on Education and Skills at the OECD from 2006 to 2014, where she was, amongst other things, I have to stress, responsible for the Program for International Student Assessment, which you all know as PISA, a panel study that has tremendously impacted education policies, not only in Germany, but in the whole OECD world. The 2018 results have just been released, and there's been a lot of media coverage about this, as always. You might have noticed that. Before becoming OECD director, Barbara had been vice president of international and public relations at Humboldt University Berlin, and she holds posts in several advisory boards and boards of trustees, and she has recently been appointed to chair the Foundation Council of the University of Göttingen. So then we also have a distinguished discussant who is Jutta Allmendinger. I hardly need to introduce her to you. She's the president of the WCB and a sociologist. Jutta Allmendinger has an extensive record of works on sociology of education, social inequality, labor markets, and gender equality. Among the most well-known works of hers are studies she's done on education poverty, Bildungsarmut, a term she actually coined in the debate in the late 1990s. Maybe we'll come back to this also on the panel. So I'll now hand over to Claudia Bookman first, then we'll hear from Barbara Ischinger, and afterwards Jutta Allmendinger will comment, and then we open the floor to the audience. So Claudia, the floor is yours.
Ich glaube Anzeige. Vollbildung. Ja, gut, danke schön. Thank you. Okay. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here today. And as Michael explained, I've spent much of my career engaging in research related to race, gender, and class inequalities in higher education. So it was particularly interesting for me to learn that early in his career as a professor at the University of Tübingen, Dahrendorf was concerned as well with class and gender inequalities in access to higher education in Baden-Württemberg. The title of my talk today is Education as a Civil Right in the United States. So as Michael explained, I'm going to focus specifically on the US case, and I'm going to discuss the continued relevance of Dahrendorf's ideas today. So in this very important document, a book, Bildung ist Bürgerrecht, which appeared, as Michael explained, in a series of articles in Die Zeit, and then as a book in 1965, Dahrendorf advocated for the equal access of education in modern democratic societies. But importantly, and this is what I'm going to emphasize today, throughout his writings, Dahrendorf also grappled with the question of how modern societies define equal access to education for everyone. And he acknowledged repeatedly the complex challenges involved in that question. Now, in the short time I have today, I would like to focus on Dahrendorf's prescient insights regarding equality of educational opportunity as a basic civil right. First, I'm going to discuss his thoughts on the struggle in all modern democracies on how to define equality of educational opportunity as a right for all citizens. Then I'm going to briefly discuss the historical evolution of the notion of equality of educational opportunity in the United States, and as one example of the progressive extension of citizen rights that Dahrendorf described. I believe this example demonstrates his argument that the theme of social progress in the last century was to, quote, imbue the abstract concept of equal rights with social substance. I think this example also reflects, or will reflect, His observation that the process of defining social citizenship rights is open-ended and it changes as societies themselves change. Finally, I'm going to demonstrate Dahrendorf's conception of education as a civil right not only still very valid in contemporary societies, but actually make the argument that it has become a foundational concept in a wide range of educational issues. And I will provide two examples to demonstrate how his vision of securing equality of educational opportunity for all remains at the heart of current legislative and policy efforts to provide equal access to higher education. On the issue of race-based affirmative action, Dahrendorf commented directly. And then on the second example, that of the use of SAT test scores in university admissions, I will share some of my own insights that I've discussed in my own research. So, first, how do we define equality of opportunity as a civil right? Dahrendorf laid out the key processes involved in the quest for equality in modern societies. The first is the domestication of power. This essentially entails limits to ensure that undue power in any sector of society is not easily translated into undue political power. And we've heard, I think, quite a bit about that issue in the last day and a half. The second process involves the progressive extension of citizenship rights. And Dahrendorf explains that the notion of citizenship rights began with the idea that all are equal before the law, but that equality before the law means little if power to make the laws are confined to the few. So over time, political equality, such as free speech, universal suffrage, and the right to form associations, came to supplant legal equality. Of course, an uneducated person cannot participate fully in politics or society, and in Bildung ist Bürgerrecht, Dahrendorf argued that equality of educational opportunity is a basic right of every citizen because it is both a prerequisite and a dimension of full political participation. In 1979, in the book Life Chances, Approaches to Social and Political Theory, he reflected upon and critiqued the ideas that he himself set forth more than a decade earlier in Bildung ist Bürgerrecht. And here he acknowledges that it is easy to make an emotional case against persisting inequalities of opportunity on the basis of race, sex, and social origin. But in reality, the belief that we can truly rid society of these inequalities once and for all is unrealistic. He wrote, "It seems likely that both these preconditions of a just society, equal citizenship rights and the domestication of power, will never be fully achieved because as we move on, new threats to equal opportunities develop, which require new responses by the law, politics, and society." In this book, Dahrendorf spoke eloquently about the tension inherent in the educational institutions of contemporary societies, specifically the tension that educational systems are tasked with both sorting students into a hierarchy based on their talents, a meritocracy, if you will, and they are also tasked with providing a level playing field of opportunity to all citizens. He grappled with the question of the right balance between equality of opportunity on the one hand and the equality of results on the other. This quote, I think, is particularly prescient and sums up this idea very well. If all are to have equal opportunities to develop their talents, there has to be a common floor on which they stand. The floor is provided by citizenship rights, and the higher it is, the better. But we also have to make sure that nobody is in a position to restrict the life chances of others or their citizenship rights arbitrarily. Apart from the common floor, the social fabric has to have a ceiling, although one might argue this should not be as low as possible, only as low as necessary. Without such a ceiling, the danger is that citizenship, and these are his words, citizenship may stretch beyond itself, such that the equality of opportunity becomes equality of result, and equal life chances turn into equal lives. Thus, Dahrendorf recognized that there will always be an intrinsic incompleteness of equal opportunities. There is a perpetual struggle within all modern democratic societies over where to set the bar, such that there is a common floor, as well as limits to ensure that equal opportunity does not become equality of results. And this struggle is made more challenging in light of the fact that it is a moving target due to continual social change. So, the evolution of the notion of equality of opportunity in the United States, I believe, exemplifies Dahrendorf's understandings of the progressive extension of this notion of equality of educational opportunity. In the early 19th century, just a few decades after its founding, the nation provided universal education in publicly supported free schools. Common schools, as they were known, enhanced all students from all social classes within a given locality. Only the children from the very wealthiest families, who either had private tutors or could attend private schools, and blacks in southern states who were slaves and therefore were not regarded as citizens, did not attend common schools. Writing about this period of American education, the sociologist James Coleman noted that this concept of equality of educational opportunity assumed a relatively passive role of the school and community. The school's primary obligation is to provide opportunity by being available, free of cost, and within easy geographic access to the child. The obligation to use the opportunity rested with the child or the family, as did the responsibility for achieving within school. This conception of equality of educational opportunity remained implicit in the United States educational system for most of the 19th and 20th century. But then, in 1954, with the landmark case of Brown versus the Board of Education, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the legal separation by race constitutes inequality of opportunity. And I'm not going to go into detail here, but specifically they were talking about Jim Crow laws in the southern states of the United States, which sent white children and black children to different schools. And in this case, the United States Supreme Court ruled that the legal separation by race constitutes inequality of opportunity. This ruling established the precedent that separate school systems for blacks and whites were inherently unequal, and thus a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. As James Coleman explains, this ruling was based on the idea that the effects of such separate schools were, or were likely to be, different. And with this ruling, the concept of equality of educational opportunity, which focused on the effects of schooling, not just the inputs, began to take form. By introducing the assumption that equality of opportunity depends in some fashion upon the effects of schooling, the court brought into the open the notion that the implicit goals of equality of educational opportunity are measured by examining the results of schools. Thus, we see in the US case that the concept of equality of educational opportunity progressively deepened over time and moved from that in which the schools were passive, only expected to provide a set of free public resources, to a more current conception in which the responsibility to create achievement lies with the educational institution. This shift in responsibility for this reduction of inequality from the child and the family to the school follows logically from the change in the concept of equality of educational opportunity from one focused on school resources and inputs to that focused on school outcomes. Now, what might Dahrendorf say about this clear case of the progressive extension of the notion of equality of educational opportunity over time? I suspect he would remind us that a common floor is indeed to be provided by citizenship rights, and the higher it is, the better. But I can also imagine that he might invoke his idea of the ceiling and wonder how far the quest for complete equality of opportunity can go before citizenship does indeed stretch beyond itself. In fact, he commented directly on a very similar US Supreme Court case that revisited the question of racial inequalities in education in the United States nearly a half a century later. In 2003, the US Supreme Court decided a case brought by a white student who had applied to the University of Michigan, alleging that she had been denied admission because the school gave certain minority groups a higher chance of admission, and this process violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Again, this clause mandates that no state shall deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. Now, in its defense, the University of Michigan Law School argued that there was a compelling state interest to ensure a critical mass of students from minority groups in the law school. And in this case, the court affirmed the use of affirmative action, ruling that the US Constitution, quote, does not prohibit the law school's narrowly tailored use of race in admission decisions to further a compelling interest in obtaining the educational benefits that flow from a diverse student body. Importantly, however, the court also went on to state that the practice of race-conscious admissions policies must be limited in time. It stated that it expected that within 25 years after this ruling, the use of racial preferences would and should no longer be necessary. In a very interesting commentary by Dahrendorf titled, "Should We Affirm Affirmative Action?" he maintained that affirmative action was and is a courageous final step in the fight for universal citizenship rights, but it must not become an enduring principle of a liberal order. He noted that at the very moment that other countries were looking to America for a policy model, affirmative action began to raise questions, 3 of which he highlighted in his essay. First, is it not the case that by compensating some group in the competition for admission, even a historically disadvantaged group, we may be restricting the life chances or citizenship rights of others? Second, is equal representation at all levels really what all groups want or need? Are we perhaps pursuing too mechanical an ideal, which confuses the absence of privilege and disadvantage with the absence of diversity? And third, is affirmative action in some cases producing a new kind of rigid segmentation that destroys the very civil society it was intended to create? In asking these questions, Dahrendorf maintained that if any set of rules needs a sunset clause, it is indeed affirmative action, and he commended the US Supreme Court to the point that they explicitly raised this issue of a sunset clause in its ruling. Which brings us to the current era, where the debate continues over what a meritocratic system of access to higher education should look like. One central issue in this debate regards the US use of SAT scores in university admissions. In the United States, students seeking admission to selective colleges and universities are evaluated on several factors. Certainly their grades in high school, also their extracurricular activities, often one or more written essays, and their scores on the SAT or Scholastic Aptitude Test. Now, because the United States has no nationally mandated school curriculum, children learn very different things in different high schools. Those are usually determined by local school districts and school boards. And because the United States has no nationally standardized school leaving exam, like the Abitur in Germany, the SAT is the closest thing to a national exam in the United States. When Harvard became the first university to use the SAT test in 1935, it was seen as a tool to level the playing field, to provide a common floor of opportunity whereby bright students from working class backgrounds could demonstrate their talents and merit for admission along with students from wealthy families. But several complicating issues have emerged. Most notably, in the past 20 years or so, it has become common for some students to engage in private tutoring and expensive test preparation courses to help them boost their SAT scores. And while the College Board, which is the organization that administers the SAT, insists that the test is not coachable, the multi-billion-dollar companies such as Princeton, Review, and Kaplan, on the other hand, guarantee that students who take these courses will enjoy a 30%, 100 score point advantage on the SAT, or they can get their money back. So these developments raise challenging questions about the use of the SAT in college admissions. And now, just last month, civil rights groups have launched a legal challenge against the University of California system. This is one of the largest university systems in the United States, alleging that the requirement to submit SAT scores in the admission process constitutes unlawful discrimination on the basis of race, disability, and wealth. The legal challenge further contends that such discrimination is exacerbated by the unequal access to test prep activities. This is the news, it appeared in the Chronicle of Higher Education that came out with this, what we are sure to see unfolding in the coming months, debate about the SAT. Now, as a liberal scholar, it would be easy for me to side with the view that the SAT perpetuates inequalities of access in higher education. And in fact, in my own published research, I have made exactly that argument. Since some students have greater resources to prepare for the test than others. Additionally, students may be disadvantaged by the fact that they were not raised in an English-speaking household, or perhaps because their remedial math classes did not expose them to calculus. Maybe their dysfunctional family life impeded their ability to pay attention in history class. And not the least of all, perhaps their parents did not have the knowledge or the money to enroll them in the 6-week, $1,000 SAT prep course. As a self-critical liberal scholar, though, I can also ask, at Dahrendorf's urging, whether somewhere along this road we cross the line where the abolition of obstacles, in this case, the advocated abolition of the SAT score as a metric for one's aptitude for college, slides over from the creation of equal opportunities to the creation of equal status. If that argument has merit, that it should be abolished, then we must also ask whether, on the flip side, whether despite its flaws, its acknowledged flaws, the SAT might remain to be a valuable tool for the sorting of the students on the basis of merit. Moreover, if we as the American society decide to discard it, then what better, more meritocratic alternative could replace it? I don't have answers to any of those questions. But I think this shows us that as the American society continues on the liberal quest to seek more opportunities for more of its citizens, these are exceedingly difficult and complex questions. Dahrendorf reminds us that we must immerse ourselves in this complexity. And indeed, the world is richer precisely because it is complicated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia. And now I'll immediately hand over to Barbara Ischinger.
Thank you. So yesterday we said, thank you for coming. Today we say, thank you for staying. So I chose the title, Education Policies from Dahrendorf to the G20. In the mid-60s, the readers of Die Zeit were surprised and provoked when confronted with a series of articles by Ralph Dahrendorf on education. He requested comprehensive reforms in German schools and universities. Dahrendorf was already well known for his political engagement and his intellectual curiosity on a variety of topics, but thus far, education had not been his trademark. However, this should not have come as a surprise. Dahrendorf believed that the intellectual in a democratic society had to observe and judge topical issues from a certain distance and by using a specific approach and voice. He compared this approach to the one of a jester, Hofnarr, the king's fool. His power is his liberty to say the unpleasant truth. He is holding the mirror to the ruling class and represents the critical conscience of society. The role of the provoking intellectual suited him and pleased him. His demand for education as a civil right was thought-provoking and challenging in the 60s and remains so to this day. Dahrendorf's analysis of the challenges of the education system, mainly in Germany in the 60s, but also later, will be the focus of the first part of this presentation. We owe it to Ralph Dahrendorf that education became an important and sensitive issue in German politics. He also reacted to the outcry by Georg Picht, who published in 1965 Die deutsche Bildungskatastrophe, the German educational catastrophe. The stagnation and policies related to education were the main target of both Picht and Dahrendorf. They challenged the politicians and put their fingers into the wounds of the system. While Dahrendorf does not entirely agree with Picht's analysis of the economic impacts, he uplifts the debate to a higher level, to the rights of society and of each of its members. The second part of the presentation will address today's interconnected international world with demands for new skills and for adaptation to the international mobility and migration. To a certain extent, Dahrendorf proved to have great foresight. For instance, we identify recurrent matters regarding lifelong learning and inclusion issues. So, second part, how to create equality of opportunity in education, Dahrendorf's vision. In his anthology, Bildung ist Bürgerrecht, a collection of articles, Dahrendorf points to a number of weaknesses in the German education system and he requests reforms. It is his principal thesis that each human being has the right to receive an intensive fundamental education to enable him to make good use of his civil rights and his obligations. Further, each human is entitled to continued education according to his and her capacities. The government, on the other hand, is required to ensure that people can exercise these civil rights. The inequality of opportunities and chances are his main targets. The social background and economic situation of individuals predetermine their access to excellent or underperforming schools. Already in the 1960s, international comparisons showed Germany's extreme low percentages of Abiturienten, students who had successfully completed secondary schools, while the US and the Soviet Union had the highest. Dahrendorf underlined the big gap in dropout numbers in schools. In 1962, between Bremen, at the time lowest dropout number, and Baden-Württemberg, the highest number. His criticism concentrated on the selective system separating students at an early age and creating inequality. The principal factors that determined a student's future curriculum were his social standing, his residence, the status of his parents, and gender, males being preferable at the time. The prestigious schools, the Gymnasien, were only accessible to students with social advantages. Dahrendorf requested a more open school system to assume the responsibility of helping students attain their highest intellectual levels regardless of the social status of their parents. The ideal school should show flexibility and allow students to grow at a different pace. Even if the term does not appear, this description alludes to the model of the comprehensive school, the Gesamtschule, loved or hated according to the political ideology of the observer. Today, evidence-based evaluation can identify successful as well as underperforming comprehensive schools. We learned that in the 60s, actually from 1965 to 1975, there existed a Bildungsrat in Germany, an organ which we desperately need again, which should also identify today's needs for reform in the rather divided education system. At the time, the Bildungsrat, the Council for Education, focused on reforms for the expansion of education, also higher education. In the mid-60s, Dahrendorf aimed to achieve 15% of an age group to be admitted to higher education. Today, we have reached over 50%. According to Dahrendorf, the talents and competencies of students are a potential dynamic entity, and the schools and educational institutions have to foster these talents and bring them to the highest level. He acknowledges that we cannot leave this task to families and parents alone, since they might not qualify for such undertaking. Dahrendorf has also clear expectations regarding the role of higher education. His main attacks target the excessive duration of university studies in Germany. He compares the academic worlds of the UK and the US with Germany and concludes that the curricula, especially in economics and in the humanities, need restructuring, forming smaller classes and shortening the curricula. Would he still be alive today, he might approve in general of the newly introduced BA and MA structure at German universities, but disagree with a too specialized program for BA curricula. We would have needed more internationally experienced people like him to shape such reforms more efficiently. His demand for expansion of higher education, expressed in various commissions and articles, had repercussions in the following years in Germany. During the decade from 1965 to 1975, 20 new universities were established and existing universities enlarged. The admission ratio increased from approximately 13% to nearly 20% of an age group. The total number of university students grew from roughly 380,000 to over 840,000 in only 10 years. Today, we have 2.9 million students in higher education in Germany. Such rapid growth in admission ratios and student numbers created tensions in the traditional university system, originally designed only for the elite. These tensions led to new activities by advisory organs like the Wissenschaftsrat, the Council for Science, directed towards the design of new methods of teaching at the higher education level. Dahrendorf underlines that the civil right to education also includes the right to be admitted to institutions of higher and continued education. He proves to have foresight again in requesting that different models of institutions should be included into the family of the Rektorenkonferenz, the Rectors' Conference. He pleads for more multiversität, rather than unifying more of the same. He gives little attention to research, but rather focuses on the mission of teaching in higher education. His ideas regarding reform of the system were not only the focus of commissions like the one he was part of in Tübingen, but were also the new seeds for the universities in Hamburg, Constance, and of course in the UK. His experiences at the London School of Economics and Oxford University, as well as at the institutions in the US, made him more susceptible towards the advantages and even necessities of public and private cooperation in education. His insights were decisive in creating, for instance, the privately funded Bucerius Law School in Hamburg. To close this first part of my presentation that is more oriented towards Germany and Dahrendorf, let me give you some insight into the work of the Zukunftskommission Nordrhein-Westfalen, Commission of the Future for North Rhine-Westphalia, April 2008 to April 2009, where I was also a member of the team and still own some of the machine-typed personal manuscripts of Dahrendorf. This assignment was one of the last tasks that Dahrendorf was committed to. Minister President Jürgen Rüttgers, and we heard that also from Herrn Lammert last night, who was also a member of the team, asked him to preside over an interdisciplinary group of personalities from various political and academic institutions, as well as from the business sector, in which he was asked to develop a concept for the future of North Rhine-Westphalia with the hopes of his ideas spreading beyond just one Bundesland. Dahrendorf thoroughly enjoyed this task and encouraged all of us to think big. The final report of the chair was entitled Innovation and Solidarity, a paper which has not lost an inch in its relevance. The call for the Grundeinkommen, basic income as a civil right, the right to early childhood education, the modernization of the dual system, continued education, and more catchwords remain firmly in our vocabulary even today. While the Commission unanimously discussed the issue of early childhood education as an instrument to offer better chances to disadvantaged children, German society and the majority of German politicians were still hesitating to deal with this issue. Ever since, the situation has improved, but we are still struggling in Germany to provide the adequate number of early childhood schools and properly trained teachers. The paper of the Zukunftskommission has detailed recommendations about these schools for the youngest. They should offer all-day programs and provide regular meals. This recommendation applies here to all schools, including primary and secondary schools. The paper addresses also the topic of the young dropouts who confront a difficult future since they cannot offer qualifications to obtain a job. Dahrendorf adds an interesting proposal to the discussion for the young people to take a voluntary social year, ein Sozialjahr, in order to offer some integration possibilities. In 2009, the challenge of integrating new migrants from various cultures is also present in North Rhine-Westphalia. The paper pays some attention to this issue, but has no precise recommendation. Repeatedly in the paper, Dahrendorf and the team underline the necessity to provide continued education and training. The concept of lifelong learning is highlighted, and the possibility of access to education after entering the professional life requested. I quote in German and then I translate. Wer nur in der Jugend lernt, wird in der zukünftigen Arbeitswelt Probleme haben. Die Arbeitswelt ist in ständigem Fluss und zwingt zur mehrfachen Umorientierung. The ones who learn only in their youth will encounter problems in tomorrow's world of work. The working world is in constant flow and requires multiple reorientation. A topical issue indeed. The Commission proposes that all citizens should have the right to a one-year sabbatical during their professional life in order to engage in continued education. The relevant organizations and institutions are supposed to contribute to this end. The discussion on this topic continues, and some countries progress in this direction. The team engaged also in the field of research criticized the lack of competitiveness of universities in North Rhine-Westphalia in innovation. They challenged the government of North Rhine-Westphalia to cooperate closely with universities in order to promote research collaboration with industry in this particular Bundesland. And now I come to part 3, the educational priorities of the G20 agenda. And it's only 1/3 of the paper, so don't worry, it won't be too long. In this last part of my presentation, I turn to the international level and analyze the commitment of countries in this struggle for better education policies and better learning outcomes for their students. We will discover that a number of Dahrendorf's ideas and recommendations are still relevant today, while others appear overtaken by new developments. For a long time, governments have been commenting on the education system without having real evidence of the performance of their students. PISA, the Program for International Student Assessment, delivered in 2001 the first survey on the learning outcomes of 15-year-old students from 32 countries. For Germany, the results, as many of you know, were a shock. The second shock after the publication of Picht's The German Educational Catastrophe. This time, tests in literacy in Germany showed that the 15-year-olds performed under average in comparison with other countries. Ever since, the PISA community has grown, and in 2018, 600,000 students representing 32 million 15-year-olds in the schools of 79 high and middle-income countries and economies took the internationally agreed 2-hour test. Only 2 days ago, December 3rd, the newest PISA survey was published. It shocked, again, Germany. Since Germany performed in all 3 categories, literacy, numeracy, natural sciences, below the scores it obtained 3 years earlier. It is still situated a few scores above OECD average, but this should not satisfy us. What is most worrisome about the new results is the following. In Germany, advantaged students outperformed disadvantaged students in reading by 113 score points, which is equivalent to 2 years of schooling. This is larger than the average difference between the 2 groups in OECD countries, and it has increased in 2017. Furthermore, in Germany, 70% of students enrolled in a disadvantaged school, and 34% of students enrolled in an advantaged school attend a school whose principal reported that the capacity of the school to provide instruction is hindered, at least to some extent, by a lack of teaching staff. The percentage quoted here double the numbers given in the average of OECD countries. This is a scandal. Dahrendorf criticized in conversations that the work of OECD, including PISA, referred mainly to economic interests. Would he still be alive, he could appreciate the increased social commitment in some of the OECD domains, especially in education. In September 2016, the United Nations adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. Goal 4 of the SDGs is a global goal and puts the quality of education in the forefront, as opposed to the Millennium Development Goals, which included a quantitative target, which was the universal primary education. In 2005, the majority of countries achieved this goal, the quantitative. In total, including Africa and Asia by nearly 90%. PISA and the new program, PISA for Development, the adapted PISA for low-income countries, like for instance Honduras, will serve as the major tools to measure the learning outcomes in countries. What are the skills that students of the 21st century will need? What makes people successful and resilient in their professional and personal lives? It is the competencies and character qualities developed through schooling rather than the qualifications and credentials gained. These competencies are also key in determining individual well-being and the prosperity of societies. Success in education is no longer mainly about reproducing content knowledge. It is about extrapolating from what we know and applying that knowledge creatively in new situations. Schooling needs to be much more about ways of thinking, involving creativity, critical thinking, problem solving, and judgment. PISA has paid tribute to these principles. The changes in demand for skills stretch all over the world. There's a drastic evolution of employment demanding high problem-solving skills. Also a strong decrease in the demand for routine manual skills, but even stronger, decrease in routine cognitive skills. Together with international experts, OECD has developed indicators to measure a specific set of global skills, which gain importance in a world of increased mobility and of migration. In the PISA background questionnaire, students are asked to report how familiar they are with global issues, how developed their linguistic and communication skills are, to what extent they hold certain attitudes, such as respect for people from different cultural backgrounds, and what opportunities they have at school to develop global competence. Answers to the school and teacher questionnaires will provide a comparative picture of how education systems are integrating global, international, and intercultural perspectives throughout the curriculum and in classroom activities. Additional test items will measure students' cognitive skills and some social skills, and the student questionnaire has items to assess attitudes. The analysis of the PISA global competence will be published only in 2020. It has taken countries a long time to prepare for a more diverse population. Tens of thousands of migrants and asylum seekers have been flooding into Europe to seek safety and a better life. In 2015, the percentage of the population of 15-year-old immigrants had grown in Europe to 12.5% from 9.4% in 2006. In 2018, 22% of students had an immigrant status. Amongst these immigrant students, fewer than 1 in 2 were socioeconomically disadvantaged. The immigrant students do perform lower than the non-immigrant students. The remarkable cross-country variation in performance between immigrant students and students without an immigrant background, even after accounting for socioeconomic status, is striking. Even if the culture and the education acquired before migrating have an impact on student performance, the country where immigrant students settle seems to matter much more. Designing education policies to address immigrant students' needs, particular language instruction, is not easy, and education policy alone is insufficient. Immigrant students' performance in PISA is more strongly and negatively associated with the concentration of disadvantaged students in schools than with the concentration of immigrants or of students who speak at home a language that is different from the language of instruction. Dahrendorf had already pointed to the necessary flexibility of schools, excluding early tracking and allowing students to grow at different speeds. In the PISA report released this year, these deficiencies in the German system are again addressed. In the majority of OECD and G20 member countries, early childhood education is identified as one of the most valuable instruments for education, for integration. This explains why we find it frequently on the international agenda. Argentina was the first host country to include education in their G20 summit in 2018, with a special emphasis on early childhood education, ECEC. Japan, which presented education in a side event of their G20 summit in this year, included early childhood as well. A new survey underlines to what extent children of immigrants profit from attending formal childcare and preschool services and continue to reap the benefits far beyond childhood. Dahrendorf had foresight when postulating in the Nordrhein-Westfalen Commission's report on access to early childhood education as a civil right. Today, we still benefit from Dahrendorf's ideas expressed in numerous books, reports, and speeches. In the past decade, girls have progressed well in the education ladder. Today, in most of the OECD countries, they outnumber the higher education student population. In many regards, Dahrendorf's critical analysis and his role as the intellectual jester, the king's fool, have pushed education reforms and resulted in educational expansion, especially in the area of higher education. It is time that other intellectuals interfere more in politics and protest against the new stagnation in education policies, be it in inclusion matters, be it in the upgrading of the teacher's profession or in university governance issues. Who are the volunteers to follow him? Thank you.
I don't know if this is the question Jutta Allmendinger wants to answer to, but I don't want to raise this image of an intellectual jester, and I don't know if you would subscribe to it, but maybe that's just a role that you're taking on, so the floor is yours.
First of all, thank you very, very much, Barbara and Claudia, for talking in length over the phone over the last couple of weeks, so that your two contributions did not replicate themselves, but really touched on quite different topics, which in one way or the other convene as well. So I think it's great, and I'm not going to answer those questions. They are very knowledgeable people who do so. I would like to arrange it a little bit differently and give you, staying in my 10 minutes, first an insight of what I think the major distribution of Dahrendorf is until today, and then what we actually achieved since his death, and what we did not achieve, and what needs to be done, in my view. And I try to do it as quickly as possible. So what I liked most, and this changed a year before his death only, but until then, he never talked about education like functionalist theorists do, according to the link between education and the labor market. For him, education was always to increase self-confidence, to increase curiosity, to be able to show solidarity and to accept solidarity. It was about the person and the integration of the person in society at large. When we look at recent data, this disappeared. So it's not, when we look at what are the great social divides, it's not labor market participation anymore. It's not the income. It's education. And those people who have a poor education tell us, when we ask them, do you want to meet people who are a little bit different than you? They say no. When we ask them, do you think people who are different from you want to meet you? They say no. So they exclude themselves and they feel entirely excluded. So it's a double exclusion which easily links to what Wolfgang Merkel and Timothy Ortega yesterday said in terms of new divides which come back to old ones. It also very much links to this problem which we more and more have, that we cannot only talk about a redistribution of money, but that we also have to talk about a redistribution of dignity, of respect, and sort of making and feeling people welcome to society. Now, what has been achieved? For most, we are extremely good in terms of educational expansion. If we look over the 40 years since he has written his first book, educational expansion in Germany is huge. Second, he was writing in an area where we still had this three-partite educational system with those 3 layers. We now have 2 layers. We don't get rid of those gymnasiums in all states, but at least, 3 layers, 2 layers. He also labels this very famous term of the katholisches Arbeitermädchen vom Lande, so the disadvantage of people who are Catholic, a disadvantage of people who are coming from a working family background, the disadvantage of girls, and the disadvantage of a rural compared to urban areas. So if you look at those 4, we do not see any differences anymore in terms of Christian religion, so between Protestants and Catholic girls and males there is no difference anymore. In terms of sex, women by far outperformed men at all layers, which did not translate whatsoever in their occupational success, but this is another story I'm not head on. In terms of urban-rural, we were very good until 10 or 15 years ago. Now we are getting worse and worse again, which has something to do with increasing urbanization in the last couple of years and the loss of infrastructure in those rural areas which are left behind. So schooling and the difference in schooling outcomes increases since a couple of years again. What we also achieved that we have by far better data, and I'll come back to this later. What we did not achieve, and you notice this, that I did not talk about social background. I talked about urban-rural, I talked about sex, and I talked about religion, but I did not talk about social background. Nothing has been achieved. It's even the opposite. We see that the ties between where you come from and where you get it are getting much more tight, and I usually say, well, when my son was born, he already achieved his Abitur. Nothing was done, had to be done there. I mean, this sort of is pre-birth achievement, and just the opposite holds for migrant families. Well, we cannot talk about migrant families in general, but coming from specific areas from Europe or from other areas in the world. This increase has a lot to do with an increase in social closure, which we see over time, so that people with a good education are partnering people with good education as well. And we do not see this mobility which we saw until 15 years ago between partners with low and high education driven by attractiveness. So it's this old story that a medical doctor now does not marry anymore a nurse, but only another medical doctor. So this is social closeness, and of course this tremendously increases social inequality and in particular educational performance. What we also did not achieve is that we include parents in the education of our young people, so that the link between schools and parental background increases, so that we feel and ask the parents to feel welcome at school as well, which we know is instrumental for better schools. And this is something Dahrendorf always was pointing to. He, and you mentioned this in this future commission, made this very big point that we need to change our curricula to a broader sense of education, and this has not been done yet. And if you look at the recent data on digitalization and how much people know, how much scholars know about digitalization, Germany is way backwards. So we are not good in this either, and we are not good in giving teachers fair training at all, actually. So when I stayed in the US for a couple of months last year, I saw that in particular school leaders who are heading schools have an enormous and ongoing training over their entire life, which in Germany is not provided. This is just a seniority line, so they are entirely they really don't know how to do the job, as teachers don't know and are not trained to do this job, given an increasing number of heterogeneous student body. I think that what we need to do is very clear. And the first thing what needs to be done is, as we did it with our income schemes, and we introduced the minimum wage, I think that we should really focus on giving all children in Germany, at least or worldwide, something like a minimum training. This is what I mean with getting rid of Bildungsarmut or educational poverty. So in Germany, we still have 17% of our children who either do not have the basic schooling or do not have any occupational training at all. This probably means to become more modest, because I'm not talking about a decrease of inequality of education, but I very much would like to strengthen that at least we should have a basic education for everyone. And nobody can tell me that this is not possible, because international comparative data say and show us that other countries are much better in reducing the percentage of young people who are in educational poverty. The second thing is that we really have to think differently about politics. We have, one minister of educational politics. She has nothing to say. It's always a she. Since I live, it's always a she, because we have this federalism, and she has to, deal with all those different states. But that's not my major point. We really have to think about educational policy also in terms of housing policy, because education really matters in terms of housing. We have seen many studies by Michael Wrase, by Marcel Helbig, who, when they talk about private schools, and they are very famous about their many writings about private schools, that once a poor neighborhood has a private school, it really decreases segregation considerably. So people do not move out of those neighborhoods as easily and as fast. Do you want to stop me?
No,
I'm not done with my 10
But in the
minutes.
school, there, the children are segregated because it's a homogeneous group of school children. No,
Sure,
sorry.
but we can argue later. But you also showed, and I'm quoting actually your work, my friend, that in those rare cases when you have private schools in poor neighborhood areas, this really helps in terms of stopping for the segregation. So we need to come to an integrated housing policy where you really put the good schools in those poor neighborhoods rather than using a busing system, which never has really fully employed in Germany, but does not show the results in other countries as well. And we need to link education much more to family policies, and we are not really done with giving children a basic income yet, and we need to go to this direction as well. We need to take seriously what Dahrendorf has offered, and you as well, Barbara, because you have been part of this commission, to work more towards disorderly life courses. So when I was studying in the United States, I was always admired coming from a country with very orderly life courses. So forced education, and then we live from this one education and this one job for 40 years, and then we retire. And Americans always tell us this is fascinating because we have to change our jobs, we have to do all this on-the-job training, we do not have this dual system. And I think that the time's ripe to give up this orderly life course and come up to disorderly life courses such that we have a second, or at least that we have a second chance for an education and a second and third chance for good occupational training. And we don't even have the right word for this because we talk about lifelong education or further education. This is not what I mean. I really mean a second education or a second training for quite a different job. The next, and of course, you know, we have support those disorderly life courses, which you also have in your commission with some sort of basic income, at least, you know, for those periods in which you are out of work, because otherwise this further training or whatever will be even more unequal between those who already have a lot of education and those who do not, and therefore do not have access to this. I entirely agree that we need to have this Bildungsrat. We know that my home state, Baden-Württemberg, in the state where I lived for 15 years, Bavaria, started out of it. So there is not much hope that this will come true, and I deeply regret this. We need a national strategy, and we need to have limits to federalism much higher than we have them now. Then I probably have a couple of smaller things which relates to thinking about this entire stuff of curricula, but because you mentioned this already, and international comparative research, I will stop at pointing out that we are not very good in using the new data we have, and that we are also in science, in research, and that we are also not very good in using this tremendous money which we get from foundations. So the big foundations like the Bertelsmann Foundation and all foundations I know put a lot of money in singular schools, and then they invest money in particular schools, in particular students coming from low family background, and they are great. I mean, then they can show that this is this student, you know, coming from his low background, and then, of course, he can go and perform his university studies. But we do not use this money to do experimental research, to have control groups, to take the time to really find out what matters causally. And I try this since at least 10 years without any success in this direction. Or, well, I should probably say only small success. We also have to know that we, in addition to having now this international of grades comparison of the number of years in school and grades, we have competencies, and we know by many, many studies that competencies do not converge with the grades people get. And we do not make anything out of it, which is a pity. So, because the data are there, and we do not use them to the extent we should use them at all. So, I think with those couple of remarks, I would like to stop.
Thank you, Jutta Allmendinger. I think we have now very much food for thought, and I think we agreed also that we will be introducing the audience immediately. So, it's up to you if you have questions. comments, then we would include this into the discussion, and then I would hand over to you, the panelists again. So, are there any comments or questions? Yeah, still.
So I thoroughly enjoyed all of the presentations. I was struck by how much the discussion is framed within the national context, and I was thinking actually, especially with Claudia Bookman's comments on the SAT exams, we worry also about the GREs for a graduate education, whether they flatten international access or whether they exacerbate it. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts on what the lessons are from the national context to this kind of flattening of access internationally to reduce inequalities at the highest levels.
Okay, I think we are collect some of the contributions. So Dieter Gosewinkel, I think, is next, and then...
Thank you. Dieter Gosewinkel, Center for Global Constitutionalism at the WZB. Please forgive me a more formal, more conceptual question. I had the chance to talk to Ralph Dahrendorf about the conceptualizing of citizenship, and he told me that he had very much admiration for the great, important British sociologist T.H. Marshall. But coming to these three categories of civil rights, political rights, and social rights, he thought that the category of social rights might be the weakest one on another level than political and civil rights. And this is my question to all of you, and thank you very much for your contributions, because you turned around that question. Is education a civil right, or is it a social right? And I think it makes difference because Ralph Dahrendorf is turning around a more liberal conception of a right to education. He says that there is a ceiling, complete equality is not attainable, and he sees something like individual differences, whereas the conception of social rights, educational social rights, might go to the result, might give individual claim for having the same result, having complete education justice as a result. Do you agree that we should leave it like a civil right or go to a social right?
Okay, I would take just one more question from...
Yes, Hans-Peter Biege, it fits very well. Once upon a time there was an expression of Bildungspolitiker, which nobody knows today, even though famous people who do that job today. In those days, with Ralph Dahrendorf, I participated in discussions in what was then still a liberal party in Baden-Württemberg, and when we discussed the issue of social rights, we had the idea, yes, we should do now more of comprehensive schools. That was the first topic, comprehensive school. There was a liberal form of comprehensive school we invented then, never implemented. And Ralph Dahrendorf said, yes, civil rights, social rights, okay. I'm very okay with the idea that we should lift up what is it?
Floor.
The soul.
Floor.
Floor, yes, the floor. We should lift up the floor. I'm okay with that. That's social rights. But don't forget, if you lift up the floor, you need to lift up the ceiling as well in order to get enough space for opportunities. That was this double bind.
Okay, then we now have a first round of answers. And would you like to start, Barbara?
Yeah, I can do that. Very interesting. Is it a civil right or a social right? I think it's both. And it originated, in a way, his thinking about education as a civil right when he communicated with Hannah Arendt. And Hannah Arendt really implanted in Dahrendorf this thirst for the civil right for education. And with the African American background and all the, you mentioned the history, and this happened as the first inspiration. This is my reading of the biographies. So the social right came later in analyzing also the new situations of migration, etc., and being more aware of socio-economical disadvantages, which were featured in a special way in some of the European countries. That's my understanding, but maybe we can discuss that together and see where we go from there. Bildungspolitiker, yes, we need them desperately. I appeal to all of you to engage. I think we really need to form some heavy activist group and to really request a new Bildungsrat in Germany. And maybe we can learn from some other countries, but not everything is beautiful in the United States either, nor in Italy, nor in Spain. Poland has done very well, and they have concentrated on social economic disadvantages. And Portugal also advanced fast. So there are some countries which have really advanced in their entire learning outcomes strategies by focusing on inclusion and making sure that they have mixed schools and do a better job in integrating migrants and other disadvantaged groups. I think there is lots of space at the upper ceiling, and when you look at the future jobs, the skills, the higher skills are needed, and that's why we have to provide the right training and education in order to make the younger generation fit for these new jobs. And the vocational education system can't really answer to all these challenges and demands. To some, yes, but we definitely need also more graduates in higher education. Thank you.
And the flip side of what you just said, right? We have a situation of often the grass is greener, because in the United States, we essentially have a college for all education system. We do not have a dual system. We have very weak vocational education. And so we often look to Germany as the example, as what we should strive towards as we are trying to figure out how do we design a system of training that is flexible, that is modifiable as economies and occupational structures are changing rapidly. How do we design a system? And I'm also struck by Jutta's comments in that, you know, again, looking at the German system and saying, oh, you have this figured out, this life course trajectory, and then the German system thinking, oh, the US has such a nice we are the system of second chances. Yes, you can go back to the university as an adult, you can take online courses, you can do all of these things. So I guess to me that brings up the issue of in this very important kind of comparative analysis that we as international stratification scholars or education scholars tend to do, the real challenge lies in, you know, there is that any system that we decide, that modern democratic liberal societies choose to go with has both its strengths and also its weaknesses. And to speak to Marketan's question of this flattening of access, I mean, again, this is two sides of the same coin in terms of how do we, on the one hand, pursue an educational system that can provide equity, equality of opportunity on the one hand, yet also allow for excellence, and what metrics do we use? How do we figure out which features of a student's experience set or talents, how do we measure those things, and which levers do we pull to say, okay, this student is best suited for higher education. This student is best suited for more vocational training. And that has been an ongoing challenge, I think, regardless of the structure of the educational systems that exist. So that's maybe not so much an answer, but more of a thought on some of the concepts that have been raised here.
Okay. You want to answer me?
I want to add just a quick comment. It just reminds me of examples in Australia. And I visited in Sydney schools which combined higher education and vocational education under one roof. And it turned out that this was especially fruitful for young boys who, after so many years of schooling, were absolutely fed up with theoretical learning, enjoyed 1 or 2 years of practical training, and then had second thoughts and went to higher education and academic courses. So why can't we figure out a system which not only in secondary schools, but also in continued education combines this and gives you a choice and gives you also a second chance to just leave one pillar and go to the other one. So that would be the solution, and some countries are working on it, and I think that's the best way forward. Sorry.
I would like to give the floor to Michael Wrase, because I know that he has thought a lot about civil rights and social rights.
Oh.
As a lawyer, talking to a lawyer. And then I would like to have the mic again, because then I answer.
Well, actually, I'm not prepared to answer this question, since I thought it was your
not
your
prepared
turn.
to questions because we never know what questions we are getting.
So now, let me think. I mean, in human rights law, you see from early on the discussion whether social rights should be on equal footing with civil rights, and it's been a discussion going on among scholars. And we are now at a stage, I think, where we can see that social rights are taken much more seriously, also in a legal sense. So this, in my view at least, is a development that is leading to the very beginning, when the Declaration of Human Rights was created in 1948, because at that time social rights and civil rights were seen as being equally necessary to form a civil society. They were seen as being equally important and equally binding, you know. And this has changed, actually, because for many reasons, I think, mainly because, you know, from a legal perspective, civil rights are much easier to handle, to interpret. You know, it's always about, the right to defend yourself against the state intruding into your personal life, and if you demand something from the state, that would be seen as a social issue and not so much as a legal issue. So this is a traditional stance that many scholars took, and this is about to change. And now we have to think about how we can conceptualize also in a legal sense these social rights. And I think the approach to first look at discriminatory effects and the right to be not discriminated against is the most fruitful approach, and this I see is been taken much more seriously today. I don't know if this answers your question, but that's what's coming into my mind when, from a legal perspective on that issue.
Well, from a sociological perspective, as you know, and as I've already said before, I'm much more concentrating on a social right, giving a basic education as being a social right which has to be given to anyone, and not just in Germany, but worldwide, which also means that we have to invest much more money in other countries. I also see that over time in Germany, much more money is given in higher education. Look at the excellence universities compared to preschool education. And this relation has to be changed. And we still live in a country, in Germany, where higher education is free in most universities, but preschool education and good schools are not free. And so this is a tremendous, I think, injustice, being the mother of a young man who spends at least 100,000 euro per year in the moment being trained as a cardiologist, as a surgeon. I mean, he doesn't have to pay a cent for this training. And at the other side, being friends to many young children coming from migrant families, and their parents really have to go and ask for some support of money. I mean, this is something which has to be changed. And given that the Social Democratic Party will die soon, I'm also not at odds with my party anymore on this issue. The second is that I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not talking about the abolition of dual vocational training system or vocational training system at all. I'm only getting always very upset if politicians tell me that vocational training and academic training are of equal worth. Because if you take vocational training, you earn 1.5 million per life less than if you take academic training. So at least, either change the income and how income develops over life, or stop saying that they are of equal worth. I simply find this entirely misleading. The other thing I don't want to be misunderstood is that I'm not in principle against federalism, not at all. But if I see that we had 500 reforms since 1945 in all German states, and we did not learn a thing from each other, then federalism doesn't make sense. I mean, we can have reforms, but then learning from reforms, doing, research, and then getting those points which really make a difference, and then it would work. But we do this according to the political parties who are in power, and then a reform is taken back, or is, and this is something which really irritates me considerably, in particular because we also see that the quality of schools differs tremendously, that it stops the possibility to move through different states while you have children at school. My own kid, and now I'm done with my own family studies, own family stories, wanted to move to my mother, who lived in Baden-Württemberg. He was raised in Bremen because he thought that in Bremen he will get a good grade, possibly, but never get to a university because he has this Bremen malus, which we had for a long time. So, and this is simply not giving equal chances, what actually is in our law. Yeah, those were the points I wanted to make. And and I also noticed that we did not answer McCartan-Humphrey's question, which we probably should at least try to answer.
Okay, I think we have just some minutes to take a couple of questions from the audience. Okay, so would you start?
Here, emeritus of the WZB, and I wanted to alert you again to methodology of teaching. I mean, you have mentioned it, Claudia Bookman, and I thought back of the days and times when our daughter was a first grader in the United States, in Athens, Georgia, and it was the time, 74, when busing started, and these issues that we have discussed today were high on the agenda. And our daughter didn't speak a word of English when she started. And I admired that 3 months later, she could recite an English poem when it came to the celebration of their Christmas party at school. Now, how did they do that? They had to acknowledge that not every child was equally gifted. And especially the black children came into a situation where they experienced that they always were a bit less competent than the rest of these children. And so they lost self-confidence. And if self-confidence is a precondition for participate in the political process, and if it is something different than being academically gifted, then it is probably a good idea what they did at the time. They combined the first 3 grades, and they combined and recombined the kids according to skill levels in the different subjects that they taught. Our daughter was in the last, they always had 3 different classes, let's say in English, in math, etc. So she was in the lowest class. But she never lost her self-confidence because the variation, to the best in the class was not so big. So she felt that she was at least as equal as everybody else. And I think that if we are really aiming at having an equal civic education, then we have also to discuss how can we, acknowledging the fact that there are differences in academic competences, let's say, or what kids have, that then we have to discuss methods that at least preserve self-confidence and give them the experience that I can be the best in math, but I can probably also be the acceptable in the kind of subjects that are not really my first choice. Thank you.
Okay, so I see there are no more questions from, one more, Valentin Eichel.
Thank you. My name is Valentin Eichel. I'm a fellow here at the moment. I'm really tempted to join the discussion on whether education is a social right or civil right. And from a universal human rights point of view, of course, it's a social right. And in the basic thing, it really doesn't matter. From the claims or the things that were asked from the podium in terms of primary education, and so there is but in fact I wanted to raise another thing, which is the 2030 agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. It was mentioned in one of the presentations and directed to the entire panel. What do you believe needs to be done to make the agenda work in terms of the right to education or the issues that have been discussed here? What is the potential of this agenda, which has, been in the process of implementing for 4 years now and has another 11 years to go? I mean, it's a huge thing for international organizations. They put lots of energy in it. We know that UNESCO and UNESCO Germany, they have invested a lot. So the idea is that it is an effective tool for changing the educational system, for equal education for all, for an inclusive schooling. So that's my question. What sort of experience you have, or what sort of ideas you have in order to make the Agenda 2030 work in the field of education. Thank you.
Okay, I think that we now should have a last round of responses, and maybe you can combine this with a final statement on the things that you deem are worth mentioning. I mean, because it's the last round then. So would you start again? I don't know, just the one who likes to speak.
Why don't I attempt to at least respond with some thoughts about your question about the flattening of access in terms of graduate schools, because in fact I think this is a really interesting, in some ways perverse or challenge for American graduate programs. Having myself been the director of graduate studies in our department at the Ohio State University, and dealing with the fact that when we look at GRE scores, right, that again, this notion that a test score is something that really demonstrates a student's ability to excel, succeed in a graduate training program. The interesting irony is that we have many, many students applying to American graduate programs from China, from Asia, from other countries that are off the charts in terms of the GRE scores, right? And so then, right, it raises really interesting, important questions about what is the role of these kinds of test scores in how we decide who gets access to higher education and who does not. In fact, in many engineering programs in the United States, math programs, statistics programs, the great majority of students applying to those programs and also being accepted to those programs are not Native American students or American citizens. So I think, I don't know if that was perhaps one of the pieces of this question that you are raising, but in terms of the globalization of graduate training, that again raises very interesting challenges for American higher education, along with demographic changes and along with the growing socioeconomic divide in the United States in terms of what is the future role of higher education in terms of educating a global citizenry versus a national citizenry. So that's just one thought I had on that issue that you raised.
I would like to quickly speak one more time on vocational education and explain to you why international organizations these days react sometimes in an allergic way when German delegates speak in the committees only about vocational education. That's the recipe for everything. It heals everything. Why? Because at the German Federal Ministry of Education, they have the authority only on vocational education and not on the other fields. So we get overwhelmed with papers, and then comes the other story that they give you all this big advice why you should enroll the children into vocational education. And then I'm sometimes really bad behaving, and I ask them, where is your son, where is your daughter? They are never in vocational education. That stops the conversation. So I very much appreciate the vocational education, but I think it's not the only solution, and I'm very much in favor of the Australian model where you combine it. The self-confidence is an important element for learning, for motivation. So I'm all for it. We have made, however, some experiences in the US that sometimes self-confidence was driven to such an extreme that the dropout numbers were too high in colleges. So self-confidence, yes, but don't drive it into an extreme. Right? SDGs, I have very much hope. I was involved in all the preparation with UNESCO and the Brookings Institution, which did a very good job. The Millennium Goals, in a way, were also answered. It gives also a certain structure to development aid. Countries can then say, okay, if this is now the global target, we should also invest in these same targets and contribute. So I think there are lots of quality measures. It has about 12 subdivisions with very precise goals. So I think it's a good guide, and I'm all for it, and I hope we can really believe in it, because you need something in your hands. And as I said earlier, it changed from quantity, how many children do you admit to primary education, to quality. Quality, of course, that's the teacher. And maybe we should also say a few words about teachers and how much we need them. And in Germany, teachers are, in comparison, well trained. They all have academic degrees, which is not true for all OECD countries, not even in the US. So they have academic training. They start with practical training. There are many good things about German teachers. One thing they miss, which is the respect from society. That's where we have to work on. And this doesn't always attract the best candidates. In countries like Finland, in Singapore, only the best students get admitted to the profession of teacher. So they have a high respect. They continue to do research. In Singapore, teachers are called scholars because they continue to do research and work in networks. So we have to rethink a bit how we want to deal as a society with our teachers. And it's not about money, but it's about respect and how much do parents trust them. And that's also a difficult issue in Germany.
Well, with this last point, I only agree in part, because I indeed think that German teachers are not trained at all in dealing with diversity in their classes. They are assumed to do so, but they are not trained in this, and this practical year in academic training does not help along those lines. And they are left in schools which do not have the money which they need. Look at those schools in some areas of Berlin. So they are impossible to deal with, and of course this does not help their reputation. Because if they fail getting, hands-on diversity and getting at least, some authority which you need as a teacher in dealing with children, then of course you cannot count on having the respect of the parents. So I think a lot has to be done, and we need to come to different financial schemes which give schools in particular areas much more money than in others. It has been done very successfully in Hamburg. It's starting now in Berlin, but not to a sufficient degree, I think. I'm not sure whether I can support what you said, Hans-Dieter, because I do not any research which shows that homogeneity increases self-confidence, but probably I misunderstood this. So all research I know, which is, McCartan would say it's not the best causal research, but at least there is some evidence that if you have heterogeneous class composition, it does not harm very gifted students, but that it helps Definitely, students coming from poorer families and students who are not at the same level. Of course, you need to have money to help, in particular, those students, and you have to move to more individualized sort of teaching to those students. But I'm not sure whether this grouping in different achievement classes is really one which leads to more self-confidence, which indeed we need for everyone in the society.
So thank you very much. We're a little over time, so we cannot take any questions from the audience anymore, but I hope you share my view that it has been worthwhile to stay here this afternoon. I think it was really a very insightful discussion, and we've touched upon many things we could go on discussing about. But I think we now have the possibility, the occasion that you go on discussing it at the reception. I don't know if reception is taking place.
Well,
okay.
Let me first thank Claudia and Barbara for accepting to be on this panel. This was a pleasure. So I asked both of you, and you immediately said yes, and this was fantastic. So thank you very much. Thank you. And